Hi everyone, and thank you for attending my virtual clinical lunch, Studying Relationships in Today's World. This was to be my SSCP presidential address, but unfortunately APS was canceled this year due to the COVID pandemic, so I will be presenting this to you today as a virtual clinical lunch. So there are long-standing traditions in the field of clinical relationship science, but the reality of relationships in today's world requires a broadening of perspectives. This talk will emphasize the importance of taking a diverse perspective on relationships, particularly with regard to different relationship types, individuals of different sexual and gender orientations, different ways of conceptualizing what is healthy in relationships, and how we can teach people relationship skills. Now, most people are interested in relationships. Perhaps that's why you're watching this talk. And when we say the phrase romantic relationship, our society and culture here in the US and elsewhere presents us with a clear picture of what that means, or what that should mean according to what's normative. Look at all those happy couples, right? Well, in this presentation, I'm going to talk about our assumptions about romantic relationships and the assumptions that many clinical relationship scientists have operated on for years. I'm going to question those assumptions, tell you about some of the more contemporary ways we're thinking about relationships, and then talk to you about a set of skills that I've emphasized that can apply broadly pretty much no matter how we define relationships. So let's move right to the first assumption that I'd like to. As clinical science relationship researchers, we just need to study relationships, just like we always have. We know what they are, we've been studying them for years, we can just keep going the way we're going. This is not the case. And to explain why, I'm going to break down this broad assumption into a number of sub-assumptions. One, we only need to study people in relationships. This puts relationships on a pedestal, and it demotes all the other potentially important relational experiences that are outside the bounds of a traditional relationship. It also makes for a very narrow definition of what a relationship is. Let me give you two examples. The first example is romantic relationships. And this slide represents not only some of the work that I've done, but some of the key contributions and contributors to this literature. Now, the field of adolescent romantic relationships, or in the field, we're always faced with the question of how do you define relationships? And we've chosen to do so very broadly because the nature of adolescent relationships are very different than adult relationships. We're not always talking about the kinds of committed, dyads that we've traditionally thought of as what constitutes a relationship. In addition, until about 20 years ago, people didn't even think that adolescent romantic relationships were even viable or worthy of study. People thought they didn't matter. We know now that this isn't true. They're closely linked to adolescent well-being, and they predict what happens to adolescents and what happens in their relationships as they develop into adulthood. So if we really just focused on people in relationships, we'd never know about important processes that contribute to relational functioning at an early age. Example is dating stress. If you Google the term dating stress, or even do a PsycInfo search, you will not find one academic article on this topic. But you will find a lot of popular articles about it. Here's some examples on the slide. And in fact, if you talk to people who are actively dating these days, they face a lot of stress. And this stress can potentially have an impact on their well-being and on what they learn about relationships and take forward with them. So my student TJ Sullivan and I have started studying dating stress. People, myself included, have been studying stress in the context of relationships and marriage for years, but no one's really looked specifically at dating stress. So to start, TJ actually developed a measure of dating stress, and he collected survey data from over 400 people who considered themselves to be active daters. These were folks of all gender and sexual identities, so it was a diverse sample in those ways. And through a series of exploratory factor analyses, TJ found that the measure has 4 categories. One category is what he called partner mismatch, which reflects expectations that don't match and uncertainty about whether the partner would be a good partner for you. Another category reflects mixed signals, right? Problems related to potential partners not being clear or forthcoming about whether they're actually interested. Category is what TJ called ambiguous rejection. And this reflects situations where rejection is implied through a lack of response, but not explicitly stated, right? The infamous ghosting that we hear a lot about these days. And the fourth category is what TJ called rejection harassment. And this represents situations where a potential partner responded to you rejecting them in a poor or argumentative manner. Now, when we looked at how frequent dating stress happens and how stressful it is, here's what we found. Participants in our sample are most frequently experiencing mismatch, right? Different expectations, feeling like they're not finding the right person, as well as ambiguous rejection and mixed signals, not so much rejection harassment. Fortunately, on average, participants are not rating those stressors as too stressful. Now, that said, dating stress is associated with symptoms of depression and anxiety. So you can see here on the slide that greater stress, reported stress in all domains, is related to depressive symptoms and anxiety symptoms. And then more frequent mixed signals and partner mismatch is related to depressive symptoms. Same thing for anxiety, but also rejection harassment. In addition, people who use dating apps more frequently report greater frequency of all types of stress and greater reported stress in the ambiguous rejection domain. More frequent app use is also associated with more depressive symptoms, which is not on the slide here. Now, this is particularly relevant now in the COVID pandemic, given that, at least by anecdotal reports, people may be engaging more frequently in online dating. Now, of course, this is cross-sectional self-report data. They fall prey to all the limitations that come with that. The effects are also relatively small, but it's a start, and the data do suggest that the experiences of people before they're in relationships may matter to their well-being. And an important next step will be to see whether these experiences affect what happens to daters going forward in their lives. In addition, these kinds of data can give us clues as to how we may need to help daters be prepared for and manage experiences that have the potential to be damaging, like rejection experiences. So we need to continue to understand the experiences of people who are not in relationships as well as those who are. Okay, let's look at the next sub-assumption. The nature of relationships is the same now as it always was. Well, for some people maybe, but definitely not for others. Let's take a look at the relationship escalator. This is the normative progression of relationships, right? What our society tells us is the right way to go, right? Starts with dating, moves to sex, then you live together, you get married, and you have kids. And once you're on the escalator, up you go, okay? But is it for everybody? What if you don't want to do these things? What if you never want to get married? What if you don't want to have kids? What if you want to have kids without getting married? What if you just want to go right to sex and that's all you want, right? What if you want something just totally different? People have lots of choices these days. And here's an example. As you can see here, there are lots of different options on this slide. These are all examples of different kinds of relationships people might have. Monogamy, right? That's the traditional one. Monogamish, friends with benefits, hookup, single, swinging, all sorts of things. Probably some that you may never have heard of. I hadn't, and I study these things. And people are acting on these choices. People are engaging in all these different options. In fact, my students and I surveyed people about their dating behaviors. Over 800 people of diverse gender and sexual orientations. The dating stress study that I just told you about is a subset of the sample. And here's some of the stuff we found about their dating behaviors. We asked them, when they're using dating apps or online dating services, what are you looking for? And here's what people said. Now, people could select multiple options, so these things don't add up to 100%. But you can see that a lot of people said they're looking for hooking up or casual dates. Only a smallish percentage said they're looking for a monogamous, committed relationship or marriage. A bunch of people said they're looking for non-monogamous committed relationships. And some people said they just want to talk or be friends or kind of see what's out there. So the bottom line here is that it's really important to be aware of different relationship structures and paths, and researchers need to study them. Now, we've definitely been starting to do so. This is most true for hookups and casual sex, much less true for non-monogamy and consensual non-monogamy. Example. Here are the number of PsycInfo articles that come up with the search terms listed. So you can see if you look for hookups and casual sex in PsycInfo, you get over 1,000 articles written by folks like the ones you see here. That's not so bad. If you look up consensual non-monogamy, 43 articles. That's not a lot of research. Compare that to if you look up marriage, over 51,000 articles on marriage. Okay? So you can see that we're just at the very beginning of studying anything other than traditional marital relationships. And this needs to continue to change. Okay, so on to the next part of this assumption. The study of heterosexual cisgender people and their relationships tells us all we need to know about relationship functioning. Well, this is definitely not the case. We need to look at relationships among sexual and gender minority individuals. So if we do, first of all, we see that there are, in fact, commonalities in relationship features and issues across people of different gender and sexual identities. Research suggests that the relationships of gender and sexual minorities are just as healthy as those of heterosexual and cisgender people. However, there are definitely important differences in the stressors they face and some of the relationship challenges they need to negotiate, and even how they define different aspects of relational functioning. So for example, if you grew up as a sexual or gender minority, you're less likely to get to practice relationships. You literally don't have the same opportunities to date or to see what your type of relationship would look like. Similarly, sexual and gender minority individuals have fewer choices in terms of partners because the population is smaller. Sometimes everyone in the community has been with everyone else. Think of the complex boundary issues and even jealousy issues that could arise. What if you're bisexual and you have to come out to partners, no matter what gender they are? So over and over again, you've got to come out. What's that like? Then there's the challenges in having a family, right? Gay and lesbian individuals can't just make that happen in the way that heterosexual couples do, and they can't adopt as easily either. What if you're a trans person going through gender affirmation surgery in the context of a relationship? What is that like? And of course, there's the stress and discrimination, or the stress of discrimination that people face that are additional stressors that heterosexual people don't have to deal with. So it's really important that the study and understanding of relationships among sexual and gender minority individuals becomes part of the mainstream of relationship science. We're moving in that direction, and we need to keep going. Just to give you one more example of the kinds of fundamental differences among people of different sexual identities, something that you may have never thought about. What's the definition of virginity loss? Most people would say first intercourse, but that's a very heterosexual definition. What if you're a gay man or a lesbian or bisexual? What's your definition then? Data that my student Howard Huang just collected from our large survey study shows that people of different sexual orientations have different definitions. Here's just one example. We asked participants, does vaginal oral sex constitute virginity loss? And as you can see from this slide, lesbians and straight women have pretty different ideas about whether oral sex constitutes virginity loss. For lesbians, it's pretty clear that they say, yes, it does. For straight women, they're more mixed and they're leaning towards no. Now you might say, what does that really matter? And we don't actually know yet, but it might matter because many people have experiences of virginity loss that shape how they view relationships, whether they trust people, and how they identify and understand themselves in regards to their own self-worth, among other things. So my point really is that we can't just assume that heterosexual, cisgender ways of thinking about relationships and relationship experiences apply to everyone. Okay, let's move to the second assumption that I want to discuss. And this one is that there's only one good type of relationship, and it's good for everybody. This assumption includes two underlying ideas. The first one is that monogamy is the goal and the only healthy type of relationship. Now, as you saw in the graphic I presented earlier, there are lots of options in relationships, and monogamy is only one of them. In fact, researchers have begun to study non-monogamy, especially consensual non-monogamy, meaning non-monogamy where the partners all consent to having that kind of relationship. And the results are pretty interesting. Now, before I tell you about some of them, let me say that part of the reason that people and clinicians and researchers have become so interested in consensual non-monogamy, or CNM, is because of data consistently showing the high rates of cheating or having affairs in the context of supposedly monogamous relationships. Data suggests that about 15% of married women and 25% of married men have had extramarital sexual affairs. And this might be an underestimate, given that people have to be willing to admit it. Many people have taken this to indicate that people often don't want to be monogamous. Well, if that's true, how about make that an acceptable consensual choice? In our large survey study of people of diverse sexual and gender identities, my student Alora Vilken and I collected some data on how people identify and what their ideal relationship is to see if monogamy is actually the goal. Here are some of the things we found. Now, in terms of people's current identity, we see high rates of people who do not identify as monogamous, right? 39% identify as non-monogamous, only 48% as monogamous, 48%, sorry. When we ask people how many partners they have, including all romantic, sexual, and intimate partners, 54% say they have one partner, but 46% say they currently have two or more. This is consistent with how people described their current relationship, which isn't on the slide. Only 40% said their current relationship was monogamous. Then we asked people what their ideal relationship would be. 42% said monogamy. And then we examined this by gender and sexual identity, which is what you see here on the slide. And you can see that about 63% of straight people said monogamy was their ideal. 70% of gay and lesbians said it was their ideal. But only 34% of bisexual individuals said it was their idea. If you look at the data for gender, about half of cisgender men, 60% of cisgender women said monogamy was ideal, where only 35% of gender minority individuals said it was their ideal. So these data suggest that for many people in our sample, monogamy is not actually the goal. Now, the overall rates of non-monogamy in our sample, consensual non-monogamy in general, are much higher than what you see in national probability samples, where rates of CNM are about 3 to 5%. Or if you just look at single people in national probability samples, rates of CNM are about 21%. As you see, our rates are higher than that. They're even higher than some other large convenience samples. But what is consistent across our sample and other samples is that there are higher rates of CNM among men and sexual and gender minority individuals, especially bisexual individuals. But again, it's clear that we can't only be thinking about monogamous relationships as our focus of research. Monogamy is clearly not the only goal. Now, what about whether non-monogamy is healthy? In our data, it looks like CNM is not bad for people. People who are non-monogamous report fewer depressive symptoms and greater relationship satisfaction compared to people who are monogamous. This mirrors other findings in the literature. For example, in a 2017 study by Terry Conley and her colleagues, they compared about 1,500 individuals in monogamous relationships and over 600 individuals in CNM relationships, and they found no differences between the groups on relationship satisfaction, commitment, or passionate love. And they found that people in CNM relationships reported less jealousy and greater trust in their partners than did people in monogamous relationships. Now, what's key here is the consensual part. Without consent, it's betrayal, and that's bad for everyone. So consent is important. Now, interesting data, we asked people whether in their current relationship they have a relationship agreement, meaning an explicit consensual agreement about what's acceptable. Turns out many of them do, 80%, and this is true for people of all gender and sexual identities, which is great. We also asked them about their reasons. As we said, select all that apply, and so you can see here, they do this to manage expectations, to build trust and honesty, to protect the relationship, and to prevent HIV or STIs. People who have a relationship agreement report greater relationship satisfaction than people who don't in our sample. So this really highlights the importance of explicitly negotiating the type of relationship you want to have with your partner. That relationship agreements were so prevalent in our study and associated with satisfaction also points to the importance of further studying them. There are very few studies of relationship agreements. As described in a recent review, the majority of these studies focus on men, particularly men who are in same-sex relationships or men who have sex with men, and they focus on sexual agreements specifically, and typically whether those agreements are related to sexual health behavior. So therefore, we know very little about relationship agreements more broadly and how they function in relationships. In fact, of the studies in the review that examined reasons for making a relationship agreement, they were aligned with the ones that we found. So, in sum, monogamy is not the goal for everyone, and it's not the only healthy type of relationship. But we need to better understand CNM, and particularly how people negotiate, develop, and follow their relationship agreements. Okay, now back to the second part of assumption. Being in a relationship is good, always good for everybody. Now, generally speaking, the data support this. It's true for heterosexual individuals, and it's true for gay and lesbian individuals. But there's one group of people for whom the data suggest otherwise, and it's bisexual individuals. So bisexual individuals make up the largest proportion of sexual minorities in the U.S. According to the Williams Institute and the HRC Foundation's research, studies suggest that about 50% of people who identify as either gay, lesbian, or bisexual identify as bisexual. This makes the bisexual population the single largest group within the LGBTQ+ community. Now, for bisexual individuals, being in a relationship does not appear to offer the same type of support for well-being that it does for others. In one study, bisexual people in romantic relationships were more likely to meet criteria for an anxiety disorder. In another study, they reported more substance use and greater psychological distress. So what do these data mean? Why is this the case? We actually don't know yet, but we have hypotheses. We suspect it has to do, in part, with the fact that there are many myths about bisexuals, like they're promiscuous and untrustworthy and experimenting and don't know their true identity. And these myths can come up in the context of relationships. Bisexuals are also stigmatized by both heterosexual and gay and lesbian individuals. In fact, some of our own data show that straight and gay people are less likely to want to date bisexuals. Bisexuality is invisible, meaning that you can't tell someone is bisexual from how they look, and importantly, who their partner is. So bisexuals are often assumed to be a different sexual orientation than they are, which can make relationships more challenging. We also have some data showing that some bisexuals experience pressure from their partners to change their identity, which typically does not happen in straight or gay and lesbian relationships. The bottom line is that we can't assume that being in a relationship is always protective for people. In fact, there's an entire literature on the benefits of being single, literature that was started by Bella DiPaolo. And maybe that's another viable relationship choice. What we really need to do is figure out the mechanisms by which being in a relationship and not being in one are healthy and not healthy, and how that differs for different groups of people. Okay. On to the next assumption that I want to challenge. One's relationship life starts when you find the one. Never mind anything that came before. I've alluded to this idea a bit already. Let me elaborate a little bit more. Okay, there are three underlying assumptions here. What people bring to a relationship is less important than what emerges between them in a relationship. Similarly, one's relationship life starts and has impact only once you're in a long-term committed relationship. How you got there doesn't matter. And these ideas have resulted in the notion that we should prepare people for being in their relationship once they've selected into the one they intend to commit to. And this is largely what we've done here in the U.S. We teach sex ed in school, then we give people premarital education. Nothing in between. So you can see how these are all related ideas. And this is exactly how clinical relationship scientists had been thinking about relationships for a very long time. But none of it is true. Now, to be fair, there are relationship scholars who have always known that this is not true. And the field has come around much more to recognizing this. But these ideas are still embedded in how we think about relationships and how we prepare people for being in relationships. And as I just noted, the data don't support these ideas. What data clearly tell us is that what people bring to a relationship really does matter, and that what happens in earlier relational experiences matters quite a bit. We know this from research on adolescent romantic relationships, as I mentioned earlier, right, that shows associations between experiences in adolescence and adulthood. We know this from research that shows that what people learn in their families of origin impacts how they are in relationships. We know this from research that shows that people's personality and interpersonal style affects what happens in their relationships. And we know this from the need for and the success of couple interventions such as integrative behavioral couples therapy and emotion-focused couples therapy, which focus heavily on how partners' early experiences impact their relationships. The data are very clear. So why would we wait to prepare people for a relationship until they're in one? This leads to the final assumption that needs to be challenged. People just naturally know how to have a relationship. And this comes from the idea that people implicitly or intuitively have relationship knowledge and skills. Really? Not from what I've seen. And this assumption is one of the things that's fueled my work on what I call romantic competence. So romantic competence is the capacity for people to function adaptively in their romantic lives at all stages of the relationship process, regardless of relationship status and regardless of relationship type. And romantic competence is associated with three skills: insight, mutuality, and emotion regulation, which I'll tell you about in a minute. Now, built into this definition is the idea that people's relational lives are important whether they're in a relationship or not, no matter what kind of relationship they're in, and what they bring to a relationship in terms of skills is important. In this way, the concept of romantic competence does not fall prey to the assumptions that we've been talking about. Okay, so let me tell you about the skills that underlie romantic competence. The first one is insight. And insight is all about awareness, understanding, and learning, okay? Learning from your mistakes. So with insight, you can know yourself better, right? Who you are, what you need, why you do what you do. You can know the same things about a partner or potential partner. You can anticipate what the positive and negative consequences of your actions will be. You can learn from mistakes in ways that allow you to make better choices in the future. And you can have a greater understanding about what kind of person and what kind of relationship is right for you. Then there's mutuality. And mutuality is the idea that both people have needs and both sets of needs are important. Now with mutuality, you'll be able to communicate your needs in a clear, direct way that increases the likelihood you're going to get them met. You'll also be willing and able to meet your partner's needs. And you'll factor both sets of needs into decisions that you make about your relationship. And there's emotion regulation. With emotion regulation, you can keep your emotions calm when you're upset about things and keep things that happen in your relationship in perspective. You'll be able to tolerate uncomfortable feelings rather than acting impulsively on them. And you'll be able to think more clearly about your decisions and actions. And importantly, you'll be able to maintain a sense of self-respect and commitment to your needs, even when difficult things happen in your relationship life. So that's insight, mutuality, and emotion regulation, the skills that make up romantic competence. And our research supports the importance of these skills. We've conducted studies on numerous samples of adolescents and emerging adults, and we've found the following. Greater romantic competence is associated with greater security in relationships. People feel more safe and secure in their relationships. It's associated with healthier decision making, right? People say they make decisions with more confidence and they make them with more thought and more consideration. Greater romantic competence is associated with greater relationship satisfaction. People are happier in their relationships. It's also associated with more adaptive social support in relationships. We've observed this in our couples that we've brought into the lab. It's associated with the ability to express more positive feelings or express positive feelings in a more adaptive way in your relation with your partner. Again, we've observed this in our couples in the lab. And we've also observed better conflict resolution among people who have more romantic competence. Romantic competence is also associated with fewer symptoms of depression and anxiety. So because of these findings, and in line with the idea that we need to teach skills to people, and we need to do so before they select a partner to whom they intend to commit, we developed a relationship education workshop to teach them the skills. So the workshop that we developed begins with an overview of the notion of romantic competence, a description of the skills, and a discussion of how they can help people create things that characterize healthy relationships and reduce the behaviors that lead to unhealthy relationships. Then we discuss the use of the skills in the context of 4 key issues that are unique for college students and emerging adults. In particular, determining what type of relationship and what type of partner one may want, which includes identifying one's needs in a relationship to help partner selection, as well as learning how to assess whether one's needs are being met. We also focus on understanding how to communicate effectively with a partner, especially how to resolve situations when people's needs conflict. We talk about knowing how to make decisions about whether to stay in a relationship or whether to end it. And finally, we talk about dealing with a breakup effectively and in a way that lets one learn and move forward. And throughout, we use evidence-based cognitive behavioral, mindfulness, and acceptance-based techniques to teach people how to implement the skills. Now, let me note that the notion of romantic competence and the way we teach the skills is really meant to provide a unified way to conceptualize the skills needed to function well in one's relationship life. Although the evidence-based techniques we incorporate are not new, right? We didn't develop them. The romantic competence construct provides a new way to conceptualize the skills people need and a way to organize evidence-based techniques that we teach people. Okay, so we conducted a study to examine whether people who got our relationship education workshop learned the skills. We randomly assigned a group of people to receive the workshop or to be on our wait list. We assessed them before getting the workshop, right? So that was our pre-test. We had a post-test, which is right after the workshop, and the people in the wait list also filled out questionnaires at the same exact time. And then we assessed them at a follow-up a number of months later. Again, both the people in the workshop and the wait list got those assessments at the same time. We did quantitative assessments, and we also collected some qualitative data. And we found some promising results indicating that people who got the workshop learned something important. So, for example, this is our quantitative data. We compared people who got the workshop to people who got were on the wait list, and we found between group differences at both the post-test and the follow-up. In particular, people in the workshop reported greater confidence in their knowledge about what a healthy relationship is and their ability to manage relationships, greater confidence in their knowledge about and ability to cope with relationship problems. They reported reduced beliefs that any relationship can work if you love someone enough or work hard enough. This was something we stressed in terms of the idea of whether to stay in a relationship or not. And people who got the workshop reported significant increases in perspective taking, which is related to mutuality, as well as adaptive relationship decision making. Okay, now if we look at our qualitative results, we asked people at post-test, just people in the workshop who got the workshop obviously, we asked them to reflect on what they learned and on how they can apply it to their lives. And what you can see here is that 75% of people who got the workshop reported workshop relevant changes, right? They said things that mapped on to the skills we wanted to teach. So they said, like, this workshop has made me more mindful about myself and my relationship, especially what my wants and needs are. So that's insight, right? I learned that both people in a relationship have needs that need to be met and that compromises should take place. That's mutuality. I can think about how my reactions and choices affect my partner and will take a calmer, more cooperative approach. That's emotion regulation. Then ask them at the follow-up whether they had actually done anything different in their romantic lives because of the workshop. Of the people who said yes, almost all of them reported behaviors that were in line with workshop relevant content. Again, they reflected the skills. So I worked to understand my feelings with about someone better. I think more critically about the decisions I make, right? Insights. Ever since the workshop, I had a talk with my boyfriend and told him I think we have an unhealthy relationship. Now we talk about what makes our relationship unhealthy and solutions to make it better, right? Compared to before, our relationship's better and we're getting our needs met. That's mutuality. I've been able to resolve conflicts in a calm and collected manner, emotion regulation. So we think these results are promising, and we're hoping to continue to develop the workshop in a way that lets us more easily disseminate it to a wider range of people. We really want people to learn the skills. We're also adapting it for different groups of people to meet their unique needs. So for example, my student Jackie Jo adapted the workshop for college students on the autism spectrum and is conducting a small study now to see if the skills are helpful. My students and I have also developed a version of the workshop for LGBTQ+ college students, and we've been pilot testing it right now. So we're excited about where we might go with the workshop. Okay, so let me just quickly wrap up with a few conclusions. Studying relationships is important. This might seem obvious, but actually it's not obvious to everyone. And we need to study relationships in line with the diversity of today's relational world. We can't just fall back on traditional ideas and norms. We have to be aware of the existence and needs of people of all gender and sexual identities and all relationship types. And we need to give people the skills they need as early as possible to navigate their relational lives so that they can make the best choices for themselves and have the healthiest relationships that they can. I want to thank you all for joining me today in this virtual clinical lunch. I want to thank my students at the Relationship Development Center, our lab at Stony Brook University, and my colleague Casey Lashman, and I want to thank Stony Brook University for their support of my research. Thank you all again for listening. You're welcome to contact me via email if you'd like, if you have any questions about this talk or any of my research. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you. Bye-bye.